This episode of Distraction is sponsored by Landmark College, offering comprehensive support for students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and ASD. Learn more at lcdistraction.org. Landmark College, we teach differently. Hello, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell, and welcome to Distraction. Today, I'm very happy to welcome an old friend, someone who has been working in the fields of ADD, ADHD, since before it was renamed ADHD. And Dr. Charles Parker, whom I call Chuck, and I go way back, and it's wonderful to have him. He is the producer of the Core Brain Journal, a website podcast, and the author of New ADHD Medication Rules, Brain Science, and Common Sense. He is a practicing psychiatrist. He's a speaker. So it is a true pleasure to welcome Charles Parker, MD.
Thank you so much for having me, Ned. I appreciate it. It's really an opportunity to speak to you. I always love talking to you. We've had a couple of great conversations over at Core Brain Journal. And it's a real privilege because you're the thought leader in the country on all of the discussion regarding the evolution of ADD. And so it's a big deal for me, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know. We're still learning, aren't we? We're trying to figure it all out. So where should we jump in? What topic would you like to?
Well, let me just take a moment to sort of jump up on my soapbox for a second, Ned.
Please.
And, one of the things that's going on, so many people, it's really interesting, and I know you address this so frequently in the conversations and indeed the presentations that I've heard you make at some of the big conferences. The whole confusion that's going on in ADHD, the stigma that occurs, and the questions about treatment. I mean, we're still in a very much nascent stage. We're still growing the body of knowledge that's taken to really work with individuals in the office. And I think one of the big things is so completely, ADHD remains controversial. Why is it so controversial? Because, in fact, brain science has moved ahead so quickly in our lifetimes, Ned, that we're faced with a whole set of different target recognitions than we ever had before. So the entire diagnostic system, which has been based on behavioral appearances, which I somewhat sarcastically call the psychiatric fashion show. The issue would be if we're going to judge human beings based on appearances, and this may sound like heresy, but if you really think about it, human beings want to be judged by the science, by brain function, and that changes target recognition. It changes the way we identify ADHD and all the rest of the psychiatry business that follows, and it changes both the diagnosis, and if we really get clear about it, it's going to change the treatment process. And it's not that confusing. It's really quite easy when we think about it, and we'll talk some about it here today because I know that this is a favorite topic for you, Ned. And I think if we just start breaking some of this stuff down, your listeners can benefit from it. They can take it to their doctors, to their medical people, to their families and say, hey, we need to really rethink what's going on here. We need to have a whole different view and an improved view of what's actually going on so we can be more precise about our treatments and have more predictable outcomes.
Yeah, no. So what is the controversy?
Well, the controversy is people are always saying, in my office, it happens all the time, well, is it ADD or ADHD? That's number one. Number two, I've been treated, but I still don't think I have ADD. I've got something. Yeah, I may be a little bit better, but I don't really think I've ever had ADD because I'm not hyperactive or inattentive. And so then what happens is because hyperactivity and inattention, and of course the combination, those are behavioral appearances. And yet what happens is so much of what we do as professionals is we really treat the thinking process. And the thinking process, if it's not balanced correctly, then winds up creating counterproductive, regressive, if you will, behavioral appearances. But the real underlying issue is the brain function and what that prefrontal cortex is actually doing. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing is really important is it's very measurable in every office in the land.
What do you mean? What's very measurable?
That prefrontal cortical executive function. So what happens is if a person has an executive function disarray, it may be occurring internally, but may not be visible on the outside from a behavioral point of view. They may not appear hyperactive or inattentive. They may have actually some measure of discontinuity in the way they're thinking and the way they're structuring. And you know this very well from the work on executive function. I mean, if you just take working memory, for example, working memory, which is a subsection of executive function, which has to do with thinking and then reacting in a timely way to change and then remembering it. So it's thinking, acting, and remembering in sequence. If a person is desynchronized from that, they're going to have a regressive behavior that's not going to actually react in a timely way to changing reality, and they're going to wind up have mud on their face, and they're going to be unhappy about it without necessarily being hyperactive or overtly inattentive in a way that a person can diagnose.
Well, I don't understand. I mean, what's the problem? If they just come in and say, I'm not doing well in life, why do you have to worry if they're hyperactive? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, that is quite the point. I mean, the issue is if a person is trying to make a diagnosis based on the criteria that are present right now, there are many people that are being missed, and that's exactly the reason to jump up on the soapbox.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh.
Because people do get missed, and they don't get treated properly. And then when they're given the medications, because it's not clear what the actual correction target is for the medications, then people are not aware of what the outcome is. So many people in this country say, how are you feeling? How's it working? Well, the patient doesn't know what it should be doing. They haven't been told in the first place because target recognition is not clear.
So what are you said it's easy to measure prefrontal lobe function in the office. How do you measure that?
Well, let me break it down. Here's the deal. If you and I were butterfly collectors, Ned, and we were out in West Texas, and we were down there watching the monarch butterfly migration as they came in from British Columbia and Maine, and we just loved butterflies. And the blue Texas sky was clouded by these orange-winged creatures flying down the Mexico rainforest for the winter, which we've all seen in National Geographic. Well, what a beautiful sight. Well, if a big rainstorm, West Texas rainstorm, came up with 30,000-foot cumulonimbus lightning bolts and sheets of rain, you and I, Ned, would run for the barn, which is about 1.5 miles away. And we would run our fannies off. We'd run through the sagebrush. We'd hop a couple barbed wire fences, and we'd get inside that barn. And just as we got inside the barn, boom, the lightning would strike outside. And you and I, Ned, would pat ourselves on the back. Thank goodness we made it. Now, that sequence of seeing the storm coming, taking a quick, effective response, and the fact is we would remember that until the day we die, unless we die from Alzheimer's. That whole sequence is what's called working memory. Now, I'm being somewhat reductionistic, Ned, because there's more to executive function and working memory, but this is a great place to start the conversation. So now, if a person is desynchronized, I think it's absolutely imperative, and you've said this so many times. I think, you deserve a tremendous amount of credit for saying this, and every time you say it, I give you a big standing ovation if I can, because human beings aren't 100% screwed up, if you will. They have some problems, and they have big areas of their lives which work well. So anytime I'm talking to a person in the office, I'm saying, look, when we've done this evaluation, you've got about a 20% problem over here. You're 80% doing really well. And what we want to do is get this 80% cranked up so it can deal with the desynchronization that's occurring over here with your working memory. And you could say, Ned could say, one of the patients could say, Parker, what were you talking about, that whole thing with the butterflies, and where were you going with that? Well, the issue is that if a person's desynchronized, there are three desynchronizations that can occur. And the reason for that story is, first of all, there's nothing odd about the story. It's something any human being would do in their right mind. When the thunderstorm comes up, they would run for the barn. But some of us, when we are perplexed and desynchronized, do the following things. We might, remember the sequence is seeing, acting, and remembering. We might actually act without thinking and seeing. We might act without being aware of the consequences. The most frequently missed diagnosis of executive function, which has to do with the thinking process, is thinking without acting. And that particular problem is not in the psychiatric diagnostic manual. I mean, OCD comes close to it, but it does not define it. And thinking inappropriately and excessively can make a person developmentally arrested. And then the third subset of problems that can arise from desynchronization is, I'm not going to think, I'm not going to act, I'm just going to avoid this whole thing. A person can avoid individual groups, individual relationships, and we've seen this happen with intimacy and so on. They can avoid groups. Social anxiety is an absolute manifestation of this, and they can have profound problems with procrastination. And interestingly, Ned, you know this, so those three elements are all elements of avoidance.
So the guys out there with the butterflies and the storm is coming, he just looks at the storm and thinks about it?
Yeah. I mean, they'll think, well, they'll say, where am I going to go? Should I go under a tree? Let me think. Maybe a tree would not be the right idea. Should I run for it? I really don't want to run for it. I'm kind of tired. Maybe the storm will pass. They're going through options in their mind, and that time is setting them off so that by the time they make a decision, they're rained on. So it's a question of thinking too much and considering all the options.
And when you say desynchronized, what do you mean?
Well, they're desynchronized because they're out of tune with changing reality because they will get rained on.
So what's the synchronicity? What's supposed to be synchronized? Well,
synchronized would be, there's the storm, it's coming to get me, I got to go, I'm going to run to the barn. Synchronization is making to the barn before the storm stops, before the storm hits you. And synchronization is the process of managing oneself in changing reality effectively and in a timely way. I mean, I think it's really interesting that time is almost not brought up at all in the current diagnostic manual. And timing in ADD land is everything. And when a person's out of time and they're desynchronized, they're going to show, they're going to be embarrassed, or they're just going to be ineffective in whatever they're doing, and of course that has consequences for self-esteem.
Well, you know my line about time in the world of ADD, don't you?
No, please.
I say in the world of ADD, time is fundamentally different. In our world, since I have ADD, there are only two times. There's now and not now. And so we're often waiting until not now is almost now. And then we get things done in a panic, and so we're always procrastinating.
Love it.
Yeah. So you say you measure prefrontal lobe function pretty easily in the office. So how do you do that?
Oh, I ask the questions. I don't really bring up this whole thing of the butterfly thing until the end when they say what's the thing, but I ask them very specific questions. The three questions which are germane to this. I start with anger and ask about internal, nonverbal, verbal, and physical anger. And if a person has problems with verbal or physical anger, and I break it down, I won't spend everybody's time doing that, but if they're impulsive verbally or physically, then they're acting without thinking. That would be one dimension of a working memory problem. Then I get down to anxiety, and I tell people, and this is absolutely germane to this conversation, that there are two forms of anxiety, not just one. Cognitive anxiety is thinking, worrying, fretting, analyzing, double, triple, quadruple thinking, and I'm not sure, maybe I should do this or that. That's cognitive anxiety. Affective anxiety is really more somatically based, not in the head, but more in the chest and stomach, and a person feels it by breathing and sweating and, gosh, so most people think that somatic anxiety is the only anxiety. That is why, Ned, and this is a very important point, so many hundreds of people in the United States are treated with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to hit the serotonin, which would be associated with affective, emotional, somatic anxiety, but it dysregulates dopamine dramatically, and when it dysregulates dopamine, the person looks bipolar. So you can have a regular ADD person, that is an executive function compromised person, who's only compromised 20, 30%. They get a serotonin product for the anxiety that they do have. The person didn't break it down, doesn't have cognitive separated from affective, and they give them serotonin, and serotonin downregulates dopamine. We've got several videos on that on YouTube. But back to it. On the other side of it, we see so many people who are treated with dopamine correctly. Hey, we've got the ADD thing. Let me get you squared away with your cognitive function. Hey, I feel better cognitively, but now I am terribly depressed. I mean, in the afternoon, I drop out. I'm angry. I'm irritable. I can't believe it. I'm so sensitive. Well, what happens is giving a person a dopaminergic product, if they have a downregulation in serotonin in the first place, just aggravates it. And again, what do they get called? Bipolar. Now, almost every time. Bipolar is the big wastebasket term for the dopamine serotonin dysregulation in offices all throughout the land.
Explain that again.
There's a reference, but it has to do with the enzyme systems for both dopamine and serotonin. But if a person, just think of it as a seesaw. So if on one side of the seesaw is dopamine, the other side of the seesaw is serotonin. If a person has an executive function problem, which would be acting without thinking, thinking without acting, or I'm not going to think, I'm not going to act, I'm just not going to do it right now, come back later. But what they're doing is they're having trouble sorting, changing reality, and they're stuck a little bit. So those are all dopamine. Well, if a person says, they don't really recognize what's going on, I'm going to give the person a serotonin product, which people do relentlessly. And Prozac is the big one that people give. Like, I don't know what it is, give them Prozac. Prozac is the worst thing to give to somebody who's got a dopaminergic presentation.
Now, for listeners, when you say a dopaminergic presentation, that sounds like gobbledygook.
That's a very good point, Ned. So let me reframe it like this. If a person has an exquisite sense of vulnerability and touchiness, where they feel exceedingly emotionally vulnerable, that's one thing. If they feel a cognitive compromise, where you're not sure, they can't think, their thinking is not right, if you don't separate those two, the cognitive from the feeling, and you treat the feeling with what ordinarily would be a cognitive psychopharmacologic agent, like a stimulant, then they're going to get worse. And the same goes for the other side as well. And that's pervasive in the country.
Okay, but another way of putting it is at least the patient or the doctor should have enough common sense to know that if the remedy you prescribe makes things worse, you ought to stop that remedy and try something else.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the reason we're so far into this, Ned, is because back to this original point that I was making, if people are judging human beings based on appearances, they're missing this entire level of conversation. They're not even remotely close to it. And so what happens is, because they're not thinking affectively, emotionally, and somatically, and they're not thinking cognitively and about the thinking process, what I say so repeatedly, I'm a little bit, it's my kind of almost an aphorism for me, but, we're treating thinking without thinking about thinking. And that's been going on for years. And
so we're treating thinking without thinking about thinking. So now what does that mean? How do you mean? How are we doing that?
Okay, so what happens is the executive function problem, which is associated with unmanageable cognitive abundance and worries and thinking and not knowing how to handle changing reality because they're sorting it and they're still sorting it.
So unmanageable executive function problem, meaning someone can't plan, organize, prioritize. They can't decide what to do when they see the storm coming.
Yeah. And so they have a problem with organization, planning, and self-management in that regard. And then what happens is like, well, you've got a problem with self-management, so let me give you Prozac. And that misses the mark entirely because serotonin...
Wait a minute. Why would you give Prozac, which is intended for depression or anxiety?
My question exactly, Ned, that is the point. This is what's going on in the country. People do this. It's like, hey, they're having a little bit of a problem. They're not adjusting to reality very well. Let me just give them Prozac. I mean, give them something like, and if they know that Prozac is problematic, well, let me give them a little bit of whatever the serotonin product is, Zoloft. It doesn't matter. A serotonin product is going to take an executive function problem, like we were talking about, organization and self-management, and can make them much worse. And then they're going to be identified as bipolar. And somebody's going to want to throw Depakote at them.
Which will make things even worse.
Yeah, because then they're going to be stoned on nothing, and they can't find the bathroom. They don't know what's going on. And it flips around the other way, Ned, too, because I don't want to just do the dopamine side of it and the prefrontal cortical, executive function side of it. I can't tell you how many people who are treated for depression repeatedly. We see, and these are the adults that come in and say, Parker, I have seen so many doctors, and I've tried probably between 15 and 20 different antidepressants. And I say, stop right there. I'm going to guess the end of the sentence. And what happens with me, I'm going to imitate them. And what happens to me, Dr. Parker, is that I take these things and for maybe 3-4 days, sometimes a week, I do pretty well. And then I can't think. I feel like I'm stupid. My mind doesn't work. I can't find the bathroom, metaphorically speaking, of course. Well, what happens is that particular situation is one where they've been given a serotonin product for a dopamine problem. So that serotonin product has caused a problem on the dopamine side. And if you flip it around the other way and actually take a child and give them a dopamine product for the serotonin problem, the person gets more depressed and becomes more angry and irascible. And it happens more with children.
So, but wait a minute. What now? Come on now. What happens? The person comes in and says, I've been treated with 20 antidepressants.
Yeah, I'm exaggerating, but like that. It's true.
Well, let's say it's 20 antidepressants, and what happens to that person?
Well, what happens is they are a treatment failure because more often than not, they have not been recognized for having a comorbid associated executive function problem with unmanageable cognitive abundance, probably have a cognitive anxiety like I was just describing, and somebody gave them a serotonin product and they can't figure out why it's not working because they have only one form of anxiety in their mind. They don't have both forms. They're not really thinking about cognitive anxiety. They're just thinking about serotonin anxiety. And so the person just keeps not working, and they keep having the very typical, in my book, typical dopamine reaction, which is unmanageable cognitive abundance. They can't think. They don't know where they are. They feel stoned. I just can't take this medication. Somewhere after 3 or 4 of those, the doctor says, you've got bipolar illness, because that's the wastebasket for these. And people don't really understand executive function, which is why I'm so pleased to come on the show with you, because it's a big deal. It's very commonly misunderstood.
So what they really have is ADD, and they need a stimulant.
Yeah. Now, they may have ADD and depression, which brings up a whole nother topic.
Right.
Because that would be what meds work with what meds. So if a person's on Prozac and they put them on Adderall or Vyvanse, that's absolutely forbidden in my book, and should be forbidden in everybody's book, because there's a drug interaction there.
What should be forbidden?
Prozac and Adderall, Prozac and Vyvanse, Prozac and any amphetamine product. Prozac blocks the amphetamine pathway vigorously and causes it to back up, and then the person can get really quite crazy. I did a consult. We do virtual consults. I was consulting with a guy in Calgary, Canada, and he saw my video on YouTube, and he said, Parker, I just wanted to call and tell you, thank you so much, because I finally figured it out. He says, I've had 3 hospitalizations for paranoid schizophrenia. And I've been on, and I don't remember the doses per se, but I think it was like 80 milligrams of Prozac and something like 80 milligrams, 90 milligrams of Adderall. And every time he goes in the hospital, they took him off, rearranged it, and put him back on. And he comes out, and all of a sudden he's crazy again because he's amphetamine toxic. Well, how did he get amphetamine toxic? The Prozac and Paxil both block the amphetamine metabolism. They do it. I mean, it's in all the books. It's not like maybe. This is hard data. It actually causes not all SSRIs, only Prozac and Paxil, to a lesser degree Cymbalta, which is a moderate inhibitor of 2D6. And 2D6 is the pathway, cytochrome P450, 2D6. Any of your listeners can quickly Google it and look it up. If they've got a Prozac, Adderall thing, they should look it up. If they look it up on YouTube, they'll see my YouTube, because I'm the one guy on YouTube that's got several videos on this. And let's break it down. And if you go to my YouTube video, I've got a peer-reviewed link to the literature on the description, so people can get it. I think it's very important for people to know about it.
Yeah, the interaction between Prozac and any amphetamine. Any
amphetamine, Prozac, Paxil. Those are the 2 big blockers of 2D6. And to a lesser degree, Wellbutrin and Cymbalta. The ones that are clean are Lexapro, Effexor XR, and they're cleaner. And so those are, if you have a comorbid condition and you put the 2 together, then you have both sides of the seesaw covered adequately.
What else would you like to talk about, Chuck, while I have you here?
I'm going to say one other thing, Ned, which you're going to get a kick out of. So back to this point on target recognition, I want to close with this one thought. If people want to get their meds correctly adjusted, that is a very big, major problem, and I'm so glad that you're having me on. I get a couple minutes to talk about this. How do you adjust dosage on psychiatric stimulant medications for ADD? That's the question. Well, you adjust it based on the fact that with this new target recognition thing, we are now recognizing there are a lot of ways that medications can be faulty in their metabolism in the body. Now, I may be going over everybody's head, but there are some people out there who are going to get this. If a person takes, like Adderall, for example, Adderall XR, the burn rate on that, the duration of effectiveness should be 8 hours, not 5. So it doesn't matter whether it's 10 milligrams, 15, or 20. It should be, if it's correctly adjusted, in the range of 8 hours. Well, if people don't use those specific duration of effectiveness criteria, then the doses are off. And we see so many second opinions where people do not have any idea of what the dosage should be, and as a result, they wind up having a problem. So that whole dosage thing is a quintessentially big deal. So what we've talked very briefly about in this conversation is diagnosis, then mixing the meds, and now we're down to actual dosage, which all these are very much tied up with target recognition and really understanding the changes that have taken place in neuroscience since we really started looking at the psychopharmacology. And Ned, you know this as well as I do. ADD is the place where it's all coming to everybody's face. That's why there's so much debate about it. It's amazing.
A debate about which now?
If you just think about what's going on in terms of how people think about stimulant medications, I mean, there's a bias against them. And the bias is against them because of the target recognition problem. So if we don't know what we're shooting at, which is what we were just talking about briefly, if we're shooting at hyperactive and inattentive, we're going to be missing the mark frequently. If we don't know what we're shooting at, that's one problem. And then if we don't know how to actually adjust the medication when we're shooting at something we're not sure about, we still don't have any idea about what the medication expectations are, well, then we can't really tell the patient what the medication expectations are. And as a result of that, the patient doesn't know what the heck they're doing in the office. And they're like, is it working? I don't know. Do you like it? I don't know. And the whole thing winds up being a point of high stigma against medications and psychopharmacology for ADD. That's what goes on.
Why do you think there's so much stigma against stimulant medication?
Very precisely because of the imprecision. If you're looking at a paradoxical plague that's going on right now, and I say plague to be emphatic, is what's going on is the imprecision is the standard of care, because the standard of care encourages imprecision. And when you have imprecision in a medication that has less than a 24-hour half-life with a very expected target, and people are using it imprecisely, people will be dissatisfied and harmed by it. I mean, they get crazy with it.
Well, I don't understand, Chuck. I mean, so you tell someone, take 10 milligrams of Ritalin, and what's imprecise? I don't see. What do you mean by imprecise?
Oh, well, if I tell, like, for example, as soon as you said that, Ned, if I have somebody in the office and I'm going to give them a Ritalin, I'm going to give them a methylphenidate product. If it's a 10 milligram XR, I'm going to tell them what that duration of effectiveness should be for Ritalin 10 XR. And that should be, if it's dialed in correctly for a young child, it should be about an 8-hour burn, duration of effect. If it's just immediate release, it's 4 to 5 hours.
But let's say it's not XR. Let's say it's immediate release Ritalin. What I say to my patients is, what I've seen over my many years, is we don't know how long it'll last. On average, about 4 hours. So I say, take this Ritalin, and with some few people, it'll last 2 hours. For some unusual people, it'll last 6 hours. For most people, it'll last about 4 hours. And then tell me what you experience. Almost everyone will experience appetite suppression. So you have to be sure you eat. Beyond that, tell me what you experience. And what I hope you'll experience is increased focus. But some people just don't like the way it makes them feel. I don't want to give you a whole list of other side effects because it increases the chances that you'll experience them. So you might check your blood pressure and your heart rate, but beyond that, just tell me what you experience. And then they come back and tell me what they experience. Now, what is this imprecision thing? I mean, I can't tell them what they're going to feel.
Oh, well, you're being far more precise, Ned, because now, you're living the way you're doing what people should be doing. You're being careful about discussing what the expectations are with the medications. But we see in numerous, by far 90% of the second opinions that I do, nobody has any idea about what you just said to the patient. Nobody has any idea about that. No preliminary idea of what the medication should do, what the duration of effectiveness is, what can one do about the duration of effectiveness if it's not right. So therein lies the imprecision rub. That's why things get so bad, because nobody really knows what they're doing with controlled substances in the office. I say nobody, but very few people pay attention to those details, and that's a big deal.
I think it's more a function of of bad reporting by the press, because I think these meds are wonder drugs when they're used properly, but all you read about in the press is the damage they do. I mean, you never see a headline that says thousands of lives changed for the better by Ritalin. Instead, you read kids over-medicated and suicidal on stimulants, and I don't dispute that can happen if the meds are grossly mismanaged and horribly misused. But what I see in my office every day are people whose careers are changed dramatically for the better, whether it's a fifth grader or a 50-year-old man or woman. That never gets reported. That never gets talked about. All that gets talked about is the mismanagement.
Ned, I am so much with you, and the reason you see that in your office is because you are doing it correctly. What I'm saying, and this is where the press does come in, is because so many people are writing for these medications that don't have an idea of what they're doing, and that is a problem. And then my feeling is, and this is where, you and I have both been talking to the medical community, but one of the things I've really tried to do with Core Brain Journal is talk to the public, because I think if the public knows what these things are, is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because if they know what's going on, they know how to talk to their doctor about it more effectively, and at least 50% of that group, the doctor and the patient, know more clearly what the expectations are and what should be happening.
And the medical facts are very reassuring. I mean, once you know the medical facts, stimulant medication, is managed properly. The medical facts are very reassuring. It's So, well, anyway, we're coming toward the end of our time. It's wonderful to we should have you on more often.
Well, Ned, it was so much fun talking to you. I just love talking to you. And, we're both on the same path, so that makes it really easy to have a deep conversation with. And
all the stuff about I think you educated all of our listeners. You educated me for sure. And now I've got this image of the monarch butterflies and the cumulonimbo lightning strike, and I can visualize this barn that I'm running to, leaping sagebrushes and barbed wire fences. You've got me running across the plains of Texas, and my executive function working. I love it. I love it. You.
It's the human condition, Ned. It's really great when we get to the barn on time. Well, thank you so much for having me, Ned. I appreciate it. I just love talking to you. It's a privilege talking to you every time I get a chance to. You've done so much for the country with this whole thing, and I just really appreciate it.
Well, you as well, my friend, and thank you, and we must have you back. Thanks a million.
Looking forward to it. Bye now.
Well, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell. If you have a question for me or a show idea for us, email it to connect@distractionpodcast.com. Or better yet, call us and leave a voicemail. Call 844-55-CONNECT and leave us a message. We really look forward to hearing from you. We need to hear from you. We look forward to hearing from you. We want to hear from you. So 844-55-CONNECT or email at connect@distractionpodcast.com. Distraction is produced by Collisions, the podcast division of CRN International. Collisions, podcasts for curious people. Our editor is the very intelligent Chris Latham. Our producer is the inimitable, brilliant, imaginative Sarah Gurton. Our audio engineers are the brilliant and ever-creative Roman Zeitlin and the absolutely always reliable Pat Keogh.